Welcome to Dead Quiet Mysteries, where every silence hides a secret waiting to be uncovered. New moon symbol. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop your city and country in the comments below. Globe showing Europe Africa detective ###. Chapter 1, The Curator's Plea. A sharp, measured knock at the door of 221B Baker Street cut through the late morning stillness like a blade. Sherlock Holmes, stretched languidly upon his accustomed armchair with violin cradled across his thighs, let the note of wood strike would linger a moment before setting his instrument aside. Dr. John Watson, ever the epitome of punctual civility, moved to admit their caller, Mr. Gerald Morton, curator of the British Museum, whose normally composed features were drained of colour, while his hands, clasped tightly before him, quavered with barely suppressed agitation. "Pray come in, Mr. Morton," Holmes intoned, voice as calm as a summer's pond. Yet in that reposeful syllable lay a promise. Holmes was already at work, dissecting the visitor's anxiety as one might peel away layers of an onion. Watson, standing dutifully behind, flicked on the gas lamp to dispel the last shadows in the corner, revealing the neat disorder of manuscript pages, a pipe-stained Persian slipper, and the faint curl of smoke still clinging to the hearthrug. Morton bowed stiffly. His morning coat, costly yet crisply tailored, bore a subtle spread of dust along the lower hem, dust that Holmes immediately catalogued as coming not from Baker Street but from the marble portico of some grand edifice. "Gentlemen," the curator began, voice pitched low as though fearful of unwelcome ears, "I find myself beset by an embarrassment quite beyond my station." Holmes inclined his head. "Pray, elaborate." Morton swallowed. "Last night, as I prepared to retire, I secured the Obsidian Key in its display, my most prized acquisition. At dawn I discovered it missing. The case was locked, no alarm sounded, and there was no sign of forced entry. I can scarcely bear the thought that someone infiltrated the heart of our collection without so much as ringing the police." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes, who rose and swept aside the Persian slipper to reveal a tiny patch of floor. There lay a single, pale speck of crushed mud. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Curious," he murmured. "Not clay from a London roadway. That, I believe, is from the gardens of the museum's western courtyard." He picked up the speck gently between thumb and forefinger, turning it in the lamplight. Morton's gaze flickered between the fragment and Holmes's face. "Yes, precisely so, I fear the thief trod there in haste." Holmes stepped forward, observing the curator with unerring attention. "Your gloves, Mr. Morton." He indicated the thin leather pair the curator still wore, their supple hide cracking at the seams. "Here, on the left thumb, see that faint smudge of ink? One does not accrue such a blemish by mere library work, unless one handles manuscripts without care." Morton's face paled further. "I was examining a newly acquired papyrus late last night," he confessed. "An oversight, I admit." "Yet you failed to notice," Holmes observed, "and so you retain the blame." He tucked the clay into a small glass phial. "And this," he continued, tapping the phial against his palm, "points us to the first clue." Watson coughed politely. "But, Holmes, if there was no forced entry, how did the thief evade the watchman?" Holmes's gaze drifted to the mantel, where an assortment of chemical jars stood in disciplined array. "We shall ascertain that presently, Watson. But first, I require further particulars." He turned back to Morton. "At what hour did you secure the key?" Morton consulted his pocket watch. "Shortly before 10. The night watchman, Mr. Harper, saw me depart. He is above reproach, I assure you." Holmes's lip curled in a near smile. "Indeed. And yet, no lock was breached. A prudent thief, Mr. Morton. One who knew precisely which bolts to engage and which to bypass. I trust there is nothing you've omitted." Morton trembled, brushing a wisp of hair from his eyes. "Nothing," save that the key itself bears an inscription in hieroglyphs recently deciphered by my late colleague, Dr. Langham. According to his translation, this relic once secured the inner sanctum of an Egyptian temple, and legend has it that it unlocks a hidden cache. He swallowed. If the legend be true, then the consequences of its theft, well, I dare not contemplate. Holmes stroked his chin. Dr. Langham was so unwise as to read aloud from his notebook. He tapped the flask of speckled clay. Did he, perchance, leave the papyrus unattended? Morton nodded miserably. He was fatigued and, I believe, fell asleep. When Mr. Harper returned the following morning to retrieve me for our departure, the papyrus lay forsaken on the table. Thank you, Mr. Morton. That will suffice for the present. Holmes crossed to the window and drew back the curtain. Outside, the sky brooded, slate-grey and restless, mirroring the turmoil within the curator's heart. Watson, fetch my coat and hat, if you please. Mr. Morton, kindly show us to the museum at your earliest convenience. Morton exhaled in relief. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. You have my deepest gratitude. Holmes looked upon him with an expression of serene resolve. Calm yourself, Mr. Morton. Every puzzle admits of a solution, provided one applies reason and attention in equal measure. As Watson hurried to prepare their departure, Holmes slipped on his Inverness cape and bent to tie the mud-encrusted hobnail beneath his left boot. Remarkable, he mused, how the smallest detail may provide the surest path to truth. And so they set forth into the London fog, the conductor's bell clanging as their hansom rolled away from Baker Street. Within the carriage, Morton sat hunched, while Watson leaned forward, eyes alight with anticipation. Holmes, seated as always in quiet contemplation, gazed into the swirling mist. Beneath that placid surface, however, his mind danced swiftly through hypotheses, the unbroken case, the papyrus with its fresh ink stain, the latent promise of hidden chambers, and, above all, the Obsidian Key itself, stolen under cover of night by an adversary at once cunning and precise. Thus began an investigation that would test Holmes's faculties to their utmost and lead them into the very heart of an age-old enigma. Chapter 2: The Empty Vault. The night watch gas glowed weakly in the vaulted chamber of the British Museum, casting tremulous shadows upon the polished marble floor. Holmes and Watson entered just after 10 o'clock, accompanied by Inspector Lestrade and the anxious curator, Mr. Morton. The heavy oak door closed behind them with a sonorous thud, sealing them in a sanctum that, only hours before, had housed the fabled Obsidian Key. Morton's sputtering lantern revealed an immaculate display case, its glass undisturbed save for a thin, crescent-shaped smear near the latch. Not a trace of forced entry marked the lock or its surroundings. Holmes paused in mid-step, eyes narrowing as he surveyed every detail with the intensity of a hawk. Stepping closer, Holmes knelt and examined the marble floor with deliberate care. A series of scuff marks, spaced evenly like the tread of hobnail boots, led to the case from the far corner. Watson leaned forward, brow furrowed. "Do you suppose the thief wore boots of that description?" he whispered. Holmes's lips curved in a near smile. "Not merely boots, my dear Watson, but deliberate ones. Note their regularity, calculated to minimize noise, but also the slight wobble in the third impression. Our friend is neither fleet-footed nor accustomed to weighty footwear." He traced a finger across the marks, then rose to inspect the glass. "And here," he murmured, "a sliding motion rather than a break, the latch has been disengaged from within." Inspector Lestrade crouched to study the case. Extraordinary, no alarm tripped, no broken seals. He tapped the iron grille before the case. "Did you notice this scorch mark, Holmes?" He pointed to a faint discoloration on one of the iron bars. "Suggests a torch held close, though not long enough to char. Perhaps the burglar used a tinder stick? Or a chemical lamp? Holmes knelt again, so close that his coat brushed the cool marble. He produced a glass vial from his breast pocket and carefully scraped a minuscule flake from the scorched area. A fragment for analysis, Lestrade, and for our curiosity. He noted the unsteady breath of the curator behind him, the dull click of Lestrade's skeptical fingers. Curiosity, Inspector, is our greatest ally. Rising, Holmes followed the hobnail impressions to the threshold where the vault's flooring met the corridor beyond. There, half hidden in the dust, lay a chipped piece of clay. He seized it between thumb and forefinger. Observe how it bears the imprint of a potter's wheel, coarse earthenware, likely from an outdoor planter rather than indoor tiles, he explained. Morton gasped. Yes. I tend the courtyard daily, pottering among the urns. That clay could only have come from outside. Holmes tucked the fragment into another vial. And thus our path emerges. The thief traversed the courtyard before entering the vault, presumably from the rear entrance. Watson frowned. Yet the night watchman, Mr. Harper, assures us that no one approached from that direction. Lestrade interjected, perhaps he is mistaken, or hesitant to admit a lapse in vigilance. Holmes regarded the inspector with polite detachment. Or perhaps Mr. Harper discerned more than he chose to reveal. We shall speak with him shortly. He turned to the curator. Mr. Morton, I trust you have the night log at hand? We need Mr. Harper's entries to compare his timings against the footprints we have observed. Morton hurried to a crate and produced a leather-bound ledger. While Lestrade opened the ledger to the pages for last night, Watson examined the display case for further clues. He noted the absence of a small security latch that should have been at the rear, and the slight looseness of one of the bracket screws. Holmes, look, someone unscrewed this bracket to ease removal of the case itself, but only half a turn. Why? To mislead us. Holmes glanced briefly and then returned his attention to the ledger, where Harper had noted his hourly rounds in a neat hand, but with a curious gap between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., a most convenient interval, Holmes remarked. During that hour, the thief had ample time to traverse the courtyard, enter the vault, and depart before the watchman resumed his patrol. Lestrade tapped the ledger. But if he left by the rear entrance, why come in through the front? Holmes's expression remained inscrutable. Perhaps the culprit sought to mask his true point of entry. A deliberate ruse to confuse any subsequent inquiry. He paced slowly around the chamber, each footstep echoing in the vaulted space. Suddenly he paused and pointed to a set of carvings upon the marble wall, ancient Egyptian reliefs of Anubis guiding souls. Notice how the lower portion of the carving bears fresh scratches, as though someone brushed past it in haste. Our quarry is tall, Watson. The good doctor squinted. Indeed, nearly 6 feet, by the angle of the scratches. Lestrade jotted notes. Tall, hobnailed, familiar with museum grounds, cautious with locks, but careless with clay and height. He shrugged. A most unusual portrait of a burglar. Holmes nodded, his posture one of serene concentration. Unusual, yes, but not yet complete. He withdrew a small magnifying lens and knelt by the glass display once more. He ran the lens along the metal frame until he located a near-invisible hair, a single blonde strand, limned with a faint Duchess red dye. Note the color, he said to Morton. This is not the hue used by the museum's housekeeping. A personal flourish, perhaps by someone who wishes us to notice, and yet to misdirect us with vanity. Morton paled. My niece Evelyn, she dyes her hair that shade. Watson's eyebrows rose. Miss Morton? Surely you cannot suspect her. Holmes met Watson's gaze evenly. I suspect nothing beyond the facts. But we must consider every possibility. He pocketed the hair with the clay fragment and the scorch residue. Come, let us question Mr. Harper. The night grows late, and our thief walks free. As they departed the vault, Holmes's stride was unhurried, his keen mind already weaving these disparate clues into a tapestry. Beyond the great bronze doors, in the gloom, he paused and inhaled the cool night air. A single thought glimmered in his sharp gaze: the solution lies not in the obvious, but in how the unlikeliest elements converge. And with that conviction, he led the way to the watchman's lodge, determined to tease out the truth from shadows and silence. Chapter 3: A Misleading Manuscript. A crisp autumn morning saw Holmes and Watson return to Mr. Morton's private study in the British Museum, where dust motes danced in slanting beams across shelves bowed under the weight of ancient tomes. Upon the venerable mahogany desk lay an open ledger, its pages trembling as a light breeze slipped through a half-drawn sash window. One entry, penned in a hurried hand and smeared with fresh ink, bore the cryptic notation, "Midnight, H&B." Nearby, on the emerald green baize, lay an abandoned billet of pale blue paper, its delicate fibers torn at the edges, the text written in an elegantly slanted script, smudged with the faintest trace of clay in one corner, and devoid of any signature or address. Beneath a watchful portrait of an Egyptian obelisk, the air carried the musty aroma of vellum and time-worn leather. Holmes, seated in a burgundy velvet armchair, regarded these items with steely detachment. He tapped a gloved fingertip upon the ledger's inscription, remarking upon the ink's slight efflorescence and the pen's occasional hesitation. This shorthand, H&B, might denote Harrow and Bedford, but equally it could conceal something more arcane, he mused. Turning to the billet, he held it to the lamplight. There, on the verso, lay the ghostly imprint of a previous message. Its pale blue stock bore a barely discernible watermark of a London paper mill. The crease pattern suggested it had been folded thrice, twice for a coat pocket, once for discretion, a sign of deliberate concealment. Watson ventured, might this implicate Mr. George Ellis, the curator's erstwhile assistant, whose penmanship is, as you know, impeccable? By 5:30 that evening, Holmes and Watson found themselves in the university's new lecture hall, where Mr. Ellis was due to deliver a discourse on Egyptian sepulchral customs. The hall, spacious and hushed, brimmed with academics and antiquaries alike. Ellis, tall and slender, paced the dais with studied elegance, his hair unusually neat and cuffs crisply laundered. He spoke with fervor about Middle Kingdom funerary rites, quoting hieroglyphic passages in flawless pronunciation. Yet Holmes's keen gaze detected a subtle smudge of clay upon Ellis's right cuff and the faintest limp when he shifted his weight, imperfections at odds with the assistant's polished demeanor and suggesting he had handled earthenware but an hour past. During the interval, Holmes approached Ellis with measured courtesy. "Mr. Ellis, may I have a moment?" The audience murmured as the assistant excused himself. Before Holmes could voice a single question, Ellis produced a program and a ticket stub. "Observe, Mr. Holmes," he said, displaying the program printed by a local press and the stub cancelled at 6:15 p.m. "I have witnesses who can attest to my presence until well past midnight." Indeed, several scholars and museum staff confirmed his attendance until the hour in question. Holmes inclined his head. "Admirable precision. Yet permit me one query. This clay upon your cuff, how came it there?" Ellis's smile tightened, he raised both palms. "I was pruning the courtyard ivies at dawn," he explained hastily, his voice betraying a note of unease. After bidding Ellis good night, Holmes and Watson stepped into the crisp air, the distant clock tower chiming the hour as carriage wheels clattered over cobbles. Watson declared, "Well, Holmes, it appears Mr. Ellis scarcely departed the hall to commit any theft." Holmes was silent, his thoughts concealed behind an inscrutable mask. He fingered the billet within his coat pocket, where the paper crackled softly. "Appearances, Watson, are woven to deceive," he observed. "A man may construct his alibi with as much care as he devises his crime." Beneath the glow of street lamps, their shadows stretched long, yet these muted reflections mattered little against the vivid interplay of clues and countermeasures. Back in Morton's study, Holmes relit the small oil lamp and arranged the collected trifles upon the desk: the scorched sample from the vault grill, the Courtyard clay fragment, the auburn hair, and now the billet. He reopened the ledger, tracing midnight, H and B, with his lens. Notice how the initial character bears a slight loop, more akin to an omega than an H. It suggests our cipher conceals a meaning hidden to all but its composer. He turned the page to reveal further entries: D and R, M and C, each marking some unknown rendezvous or transaction. Our adversary employs consistent shorthand. We must decipher its key before chasing further shadows. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, Holmes dusted the billet with a fine white powder from a small box. Under the lamp's beam, a delicate fingerprint materialized upon the clay-smudged corner. "This print," he murmured, "is neither the curator's nor Mr. Ellis's, too slender for Morton, too irregular for Ellis. Yet its arcs are too faint for a laborer's hand." He applied a gentle ammonia solution to heighten the ridges, confirming the mark belonged to a well-kept lady. "And there lingers a trace of lavender. Miss Morton favors such sachets." Holmes surveyed the assembled clues with serene resolve. Mr. Ellis may indeed be a model assistant, but his presence here serves more as misdirection than evidence of guilt. He replaced each item in a neat tableau of intrigue, as though preserving the web of deception itself. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall visit St. Bartholomew's Chapel. It appears our quarry has woven a tapestry of lies, and only by unraveling these threads shall we reach the center of this enigma." Watson nodded, already anticipating the next twist in a case that deepened with every revelation. Chapter 4: Shadows at the Theatre. Holmes's slender form slipped through the lobby of the Strand Theatre just before the curtain rose on the final performance of The Crimson Duchess. The gaslights glowed softly beneath the gilded ceiling, and the scent of dust and varnish mingled with the faintest trace of ambergris drifting on a cool draught from the stage doors. Watson followed, glancing about at patrons in evening dress, plush cloaks, tall hats, glittering jewelry, all oblivious to the crime that lingered at the edges of their merriment. A discreet announcement summoned Miss Evelyn Morton to the curator's box, her own private alcove, where she sat, pale and anxious, awaiting Holmes's appearance. He noted at once her posture, rigid yet graceful, as though she had practiced composure for just such an interrogation. Upon her breast, pinned to a black silk gown, was a small cameo brooch carved in onyx and ivory. He inhaled sharply, detecting a faint sweetness in the air, like sandalwood lightly spiced with musk. The aroma was out of place amid the usual tobacco and perfume, a signature, perhaps, or merely an affectation. Watson took a seat beside her, offering polite greetings and muted sympathy. Holmes remained in the aisle, surveying the stage. The crimson velvet curtains, trimmed with gold braid, shimmered in the proscenium arch. Beyond them lay a chiaroscuro of ropes, pulleys, and hushed technicians. Even here, in this world of artifice, Holmes's keen eyes discerned the same pattern of concealment and revelation that governed all human affairs. As the lights dimmed, Holmes's mind danced through possibilities. If Evelyn Morton were involved in her uncle's distress, either as conspirator or scapegoat, she would instinctively signal her innocence. He studied the delicacy of her gloved hands, the tension in her knuckles, the way she turned her head when the overture swelled into its first notes. Then, in one fluid motion, he rose and presented himself to the usher, whispering a request to inspect the prompt book after the first act. Permission granted, he slipped backstage under cover of applause. Behind the curtain, the world narrowed to lantern-lit corridors and painted flats. Holmes approached the prompt book resting on a lectern, its spine worn by hundreds of performances. He opened it to find a hastily scrawled hieroglyph chalked beneath the stage manager's pencil, a perfect match to the symbol once etched upon the Obsidian Key. Gently, he scraped away a fragment of the chalk with his penknife and stored it in a small leather packet. Though minor in size, the fragment bore the weight of suggestion, a deliberate marker left by someone who wished his presence in this theatre known. By the interval, Holmes had rejoined Miss Morton and Watson in the box. The play's heroine had just delivered her final soliloquy, and the audience broke into hushed anticipation. Holmes allowed a moment's flourish of appreciation before leaning forward. "Miss Morton," he said quietly, "I have found something backstage." He produced the chalk fragment, its white dust gleaming against the velvet cushion. "You will recognize this." Evelyn's eyes widened. "Good heavens, Mr. Holmes. That is the same symbol on the key. But why here?" I have no explanation." She brushed at her brooch, dislodging a single pin. It fell to the velvet floor and glinted briefly in the lamplight. Watson stooped to recover it. "Odd that you should wear this particular brooch tonight," he observed gently. Holmes merely inclined his head, eyes flicking to the cameo's surface. The carving depicted an Egyptian priestess, a choice both thematic and, possibly, symbolic. As the orchestra began the overture to Act 2, Holmes watched Miss Morton slip from her box to retrieve a fan from the corridor. He followed at a discreet distance, noting with precise detachment the soft rustle of her skirts, the manner in which her gloves fit too loosely at the wrist, and the slight smear of clay upon her right glove's thumb. She paused at a dark alcove to compose herself, and Holmes stepped forward. "You seemed unsettled," he remarked, voice low. "Does the theatre's atmosphere rarely suit you?" She turned, startled, then composed her features into a demure smile. "I confess, I ought not to have troubled you, Mr. Holmes. This is but my uncle's whim, that I attend, and I dislike public display." Holmes's gaze lingered on the clay stains. "Yet you wore these gloves during your innocent stroll through the courtyard." She paled slightly but offered no reply. Holmes's manner remained courteous, his expression unreadable. Returning to their seats as the lights dimmed once more, Holmes pondered the evidence. The chalk, the scent of ambergris, the cameo brooch, and now the clay, all pointed toward Evelyn, yet any one of them could be planted to mislead. He considered the stagehands, artisans accustomed to chalk and dust, with easy access to the vaulted chambers below. Or perhaps a member of the troupe, mistress of disguise and diversion, had hidden the symbol to implicate the curator's niece. By the final curtain, Holmes's mind moved in swift circuits. He rose after the audience's enthusiastic ovation, bowing to a startled Miss Morton. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Morton. I shall bid you good night." Yet as Watson offered his arm to escort her to the carriage, Holmes lingered to examine the hem of her gown, noting a faint smudge of dark pigment, perhaps ink, uncharacteristic of her unblemished wardrobe. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid the brooch, the chalk fragment, and the glove upon the little table by the fire. "Watson," he said, staring into the embers, "the theatre has yielded red herrings aplenty. The chalk symbol here repeats itself too conveniently. The cameo brooch speaks of theatrical affinity, yet it distracts from the simpler truths. Miss Morton is clever, but cleverness need not equate to guilt." He tapped the glove's clay. "This fragment tells us our culprit returned to the courtyard at dawn, but only someone with free access to both Uncle Morton's affairs and the theatre's back passages could manage such an itinerary." Watson looked on, puzzlement mixed with admiration. "Then your suspect remains as elusive as ever." Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "Patience, my dear Watson. We have gathered our clues under stage lights, yet the final act awaits its grand revelation." Around them, the night deepened, and the city's pulse throbbed beyond the windows. Within the cozy flat, however, Holmes's certainty glowed as brightly as the hearth. The case lay ever closer to its denouement, and in the darkness of misdirection, his singular light of reason would guide them true. Chapter 5, Fragments in the Chapel. Dawn had barely cast its first pale glow upon the spire of St. Bartholomew's Chapel when Holmes and Watson arrived at its ancient door. The air within was cool and still, carrying the scent of beeswax candles long extinguished and the soft musk of aged timber. Sunlight filtered through the high lancet windows, painting the stone floor in bands of rose and gold. Holmes paused at the threshold, his sharp gaze taking in every nuance, the faint scuff of footsteps on flagstones, a solitary pew pushed slightly askew, and the hush that weighed upon the vaulted arches. The chapel's custodian, a gaunt man named Mr. Abbott, greeted them with reverence and unease. "I found this fragment upon the sill of the easternmost window," he murmured, handing Holmes a minute shard of crimson glass. Under Holmes's magnifying lens, the shard's hue proved identical to the chalk fragment lifted from the theatre prompt book. "A most deliberate match," Holmes observed, "for no stained glass artisan would produce such a plain tone." Watson bent to examine the sill itself, noting a thin trail of courtyard clay that led from the threshold across the marbled floor, proof, perhaps, that the intruder had passed this way at sunrise. Holmes set the shard gently upon a cloth and examined the window's frame. "See how the lead canes betray no fresh disturbance," he said. "The glass has not been broken here but elsewhere, and placed to implicate this holy place." He traced a fingertip along the sill's edge and detected a whisper of ambergris, the same subtle scent that had trailed Miss Morton's envelope at the theatre. "Our quarry must wear ambergris as an olfactory signature, much as a painter signs a canvas. And the clay confirms an outdoor passage through the courtyard just before arrival." They moved deeper into the chapel, Holmes's footsteps silent on worn stone. In the sacristy doorway, Watson spotted small footprints in the dust, too narrow for the typical ecclesiastical brogue, too evenly paced for the night watchman's hobnails. Following them led to a hidden vestry door, its latch quietly unlatched. Inside, beneath a shelf of service books, lay a neatly torn envelope bearing Miss Morton's family crest in red wax. Holmes's eyes glinted as he lifted it with gloved care. An invitation from the unknown. Note the wax, no emblem of the church, but her crest, suggesting a personal communication. Within the envelope lay a lock of hair bound by a slender ribbon, soft, mahogany brown and perfumed faintly with lavender. Holmes held it to the light, observing an irregular clip, evidence of hurried severance. "Not the auburn hair we found at the vault," he mused, but clearly intended to evoke familial connection. He placed it beside the glass shard and the clay sample in his leather case. "Our adversary has orchestrated these tokens, glass, clay, perfume, hair, to weave a narrative implicating Miss Morton while obscuring the truth." Mr. Abbott, pale beneath the candle niches, stammered that no visitors had arrived at the chapel since the midnight choir rehearsal. "Only the choristers and I remained," he insisted. Holmes studied the custodian's plain gloves, spotting a nearly erased smudge of clay on the cuff, identical to the courtyard residue. "You walk the gardens at dawn?" Holmes inquired softly. Abbott's gaze flickered. "I tend the rose beds, sir," he admitted. "But I would never sully holy glass." Holmes inclined his head. "Yet the clay upon your glove suggests otherwise. We shall speak of garden soil shortly." Turning his attention to the vestry's small window, Holmes noted the glass there bore no matching hue, and the latch remained untouched. He took a piece of chalk from his pocket and inscribed a tiny hieroglyph upon the sill, a test mark to be found by no one but the observant. "These planted clues form a trail," he told Watson. "But why scatter them across museum, theatre, and now chapel? The thief desires to confuse, to force us into false patterns." He wrapped the shard and envelope in tissue, then rose and walked toward the altar steps, where the morning light crowned his silhouette with an ethereal glow. At the altar rail, Watson asked, "Holmes, what purpose does this chapel serve in the greater design?" Holmes's expression remained calm, his mind clearly weaving threads unseen. "The chapel is sacred ground, Watson, an unexpected waypoint in a profane game. By placing evidence here, our adversary implies a sacrilegious defiance, knowing well that the church's silence lends gravitas to suspicion." He glanced at the choir stalls, then back to the custodian. "Mr. Abbott, I will require your garden soil samples and a list of any keys you hold to museum or chapel doors." Abbott's shoulders sagged with reluctant compliance. As Holmes surveyed the space one final time, he murmured, "The fragments converge here, yet none belong wholly. They are misdirection, tokens of a man or woman at once intimate with these locations and brazen enough to sully them for personal gain." He paused, studying the hush between stone columns. "Tomorrow we shall compare this chapel's soil with the courtyard and theatre dust, and question each witness anew. Then, and only then, will the tangled threads begin to yield their secrets." Beneath the grand lancet windows, Holmes and Watson departed, leaving behind the ghostly hush and the carefully staged evidence. Outside, the rising sun illuminated the chapel's spire, yet darkness still lingered upon the truth. Holmes walked with measured stride, a portrait of calm determination. In the delicate interplay of glass, clay, and cursive scent, he discerned the master-stroke of a cunning mind, and vowed that no sacred or profane ruse would elude his scrutiny. Chapter 6: The Enigmatic Ledger. That evening, Holmes invited Watson to join him at the museum's rear wing, where the hush of closing hours lay heavy upon the galleries. The iron gates were drawn, and only the echo of distant footfalls accompanied their entry. Morton greeted them at a private side door, his countenance taut with apprehension. "Mr. Holmes, you wish to inspect my study after dark," he said, leading them through corridors lined with alabaster busts and vitrines of chipped pottery. At the far end, a discreet panel in the wall concealed a small safe. Holmes produced a slender key, supplied by Morton, and turned it with a soft click. Inside the safe lay a single, leather-bound volume, Morton's personal ledger. Its spine bore no ornament, but the front cover was scored with indentations that bespoke frequent handling. Holmes opened it to the most recent entries, guided by his lamp's wavering flame. The ink had scarcely dried upon the final page, where a series of cryptic notations formed a sequence of letter pairs, omega and B, D and R, M and C, followed by numerical figures and times. He turned the page and discovered another column of figures penciled in a lighter hand, as though appended after the fact. Watson peered over his shoulder. "It resembles accounting, but I confess I see no ledger-like structure." Holmes ran his finger down the left-hand column. "Note the symmetry, Watson. Each pair seems to denote rendezvous points or exchanges." He extracted a magnifying lens from his coat and inspected the first pair. "Observe how the initial character is not an H but an archaic omega. Most would mistake it for its Greek cousin, but the loop at the base is deliberate." He traced the curve of the symbol thoughtfully. "This omega appears only when the exchange involves our missing key. The others, with conventional initials, likely refer to minor artifacts." Holmes replaced the lens and slipped on a protective glove. Next, he flipped to a folded insert concealed within the back pages. Unfolded, it revealed a hand-drawn map of the museum's lower levels, corridors rarely visited by the public, storerooms, service passages, and an oubliette marked with the same omega symbol. "Remarkable," said Watson, "that such a plan should exist here." Holmes circled the symbol. "And yet, Mr. Morton wears the rush of heat upon his cheeks. Pray, what is this hidden chamber?" Morton swallowed and glanced between Holmes and Watson. "I confess I discovered this map after the key vanished. I feared, until now, that someone with intimate knowledge of the museum's layout conspired against me." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Or perhaps you planted the map yourself, as a failsafe to retrieve the relic should your dealings go awry." The curator's jaw tightened, but he offered no denial. Holmes folded the map and returned it to the ledger. Holmes then examined the ledger's margins, noticing neat vertical ticks beside certain entries. He marked each with a pencil, 3 ticks by the omega and B entry, 1 by D and R, and none by the final pair. "These subtleties imply priority," he said. "Omega rates highest, the others secondary temptations." He tapped the page. "Furthermore, the penciled figures correspond to hours when the night watchman's rounds faltered." Watson reflected on the gap between 2 and 3 a.m., so our thief timed each exchange to coincide with that interval. Holmes rose and retrieved the small crate of artifact fragments from his coat pocket, the scrap of scorched iron, the piece of courtyard clay, the theatre chalk, and the shards from the chapel. He arranged them upon the desk in a quadrant mirroring the map's layout. "Each fragment signifies a waypoint," he explained, moving them to the positions they occupied on the plan. "But only one waypoint bears the omega. That is the chamber where the Obsidian Key is concealed." He leaned forward, voice low. "You see, Watson, the thief never intended the vault to be the end of the journey. The key's disappearance was a maneuver to distract from its final destination, this hidden room." Watson's eyes shone with understanding. "A false trail to the display case, and a private haven for the true merchant." Holmes nodded, returning the fragments to their vials. "Indeed. And now we must venture into the depths beneath the museum, to confirm that hypothesis." He glanced at Morton. "You remain our host, sir. You will accompany us, for your cooperation is essential." Morton's relief was palpable, though his lips quivered with apprehension. By lamplight, they descended narrow staircases, Holmes leading with unerring confidence. The path wound beneath storerooms where crates slumbered undisturbed and the whisper of dripping water accompanied their progress. At last, they reached the oubliette door marked with the omega symbol, its frame sealed against prying eyes. Holmes laid the ledger upon the floor, pressed aside a loose flagstone revealed by the map's diagram, and exposed a hidden latch. He pulled, and the heavy bolt slid back with a metallic sigh. Behind the door lay a narrow shaft, lit dimly by the lantern Holmes held aloft, a passage that yawned into darkness. Watson stiffened. "Remarkable, Holmes. You have uncovered the thief's sanctum." Holmes allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "But our task is not yet complete. We must recover the key and confront its custodian." He turned to Morton. "Gather a party and prepare for immediate access to this chamber during daylight, when the law may stand by us. Tonight, we explore its entrance. At sunrise, we unmask its inhabitant." As they retraced their steps upward, the ledger tucked safely beneath Holmes's arm, Watson recognized that this chapter marked the true turning point of their investigation. No longer were they following misdirections across vaults, theaters, and chapels, they now pursued the kernel of deception, hidden beneath the museum's foundations. And at its heart lay the Obsidian Key, awaiting the detective's calm detachment and unerring logic to expose both its location and its guilty guardian. Chapter 7, Watchman's Whispers. Holmes and Watson arrived at the museum's watchman's lodge shortly after midnight, when the city's bustle had dwindled to distant echoes. A single lantern cast a halo of golden light across the neat turf outside, forming a small oasis of warmth against the chill of the night air. Inside, Mr. Harper, the night watchman, sat by a plain wooden table, polishing his oil lamp with methodical calm. He greeted the detectives with a curt nod, as though accustomed to their arrival, yet a flicker of unease in his eyes betrayed him. "Good evening, Mr. Harper," Holmes began, removing his Inverness cape. "We wish to revisit your rounds of this very night." He unfurled a copy of the night log. "You recorded patrols at 1, 2, and 3 a.m., yet there remains a conspicuous silence between 2 and 3. Harper's hand stilled on the rag. My rounds were uninterrupted, sir," he stammered. "I swear it." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes, who laid out, one by one, the vials containing the crucible of clay, the scorch residue, the theatre chalk, and the chapel glass. Holmes spoke evenly. "These samples were recovered in your domain, Mr. Harper, mud from the courtyard, scorch from the grill, chalk and glass from places you might seldom visit. Tell me, did you encounter anyone during your patrol who carried such items?" Harper's throat worked. I saw someone slip past the rear entrance shortly after 2:30. Tall figure, hobnailed boots, much like those impressions in the vault. I thought it best not to alarm the gentleman, sir." "A reasonable precaution," Holmes replied, "yet your silence caused us to chase false trails across London." He tapped the vial of clay. "This clay matches the soil in the courtyard, and by your own admission, you observed the intruder there. Why omit this detail from your log?" Harper swallowed. "I feared reproach, sir. When I saw the figure carrying no torch, I followed at a distance, only to see him extinguish a lamp by the grill and enter the vault with uncanny skill." Holmes inclined his head. "You followed unobserved, yet left no note in the ledger. Instead, you returned to record your presence at 3 a.m. precisely. Who instructed you to conceal what you saw?" The watchman's gaze dropped to his polished boots. "No one, sir, I acted alone. But afterwards, I found a letter in my quarters, unsigned, save for a single omega symbol, demanding my silence, or else." He shuddered. "I feared for my position." Watson leaned forward. "A letter bearing the same glyph we have encountered elsewhere. Were there any other instructions?" Harper nodded weakly. "The note said that one slip would cost me more than my job. I dared not consult Inspector Lestrade." Holmes produced the torn envelope from the chapel vestry. Then this envelope, bearing Miss Morton's crest, was placed in the chapel to implicate the niece of your employer. You found it, yet you did not destroy it or bring it forward." The watchman bowed his head. "I thought it part of the same design, to terrify me. I dared not interfere." Holmes's lips curved ever so slightly. "Your caution contributed to the subterfuge, but your testimony now grants us fresh insight. You followed this figure from the courtyard to the vault. Did you notice any distinguishing features beyond height and gait?" Harper hesitated. "His coat bore a faint odor I could not place, a hint of sandalwood mixed with musk, if memory serves. And I caught a glimpse of cream-colored gloves." Watson's eyes widened. "Ambergris, as noted by Mr. Holmes in earlier inquiries." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, an imported substance, prized by those of means. The combination of scent and gloves suggests someone accustomed to refinement, rather than a mere petty thief." He turned back to Harper. "And what of the man's hands? Clean, or stained?" "Clean," Harper whispered. "Smooth enough that I thought him a gentleman of sorts." Holmes tapped a vial. "And yet, The papyrus ledger bore fresh ink on the curator's gloves. A man of letters indeed, one who might wish to conceal his own smudges. The lodge fell silent as Holmes folded his cloak and regarded the watchman directly. "Mr. Harper, your loyalty is commendable, yet misdirected. You have stumbled upon a careful design, one which exploited your discretion to mask a grander deception." He produced a small scrap of paper. Prior to locating the Obsidian Key, Harper here observed a consultation beneath the South Pavilion's awning, two figures in whispered conversation. One spoke of an arrangement at the rate of 500 guineas for the relic's retrieval. "Does that ring familiar?" Harper's face blanched. I heard only muffled voices, but I recognized one as Mr. Morton's. And the other, a well-known antiquarian named Mr. Collins. Watson gasped. "Collins? The jewelry dealer with whom Morton negotiated trades. This aligns with the ledger's coded entries, the omega denoting that highest value transaction." Holmes regarded the watchman with quiet approval. "Precisely. You witnessed the curator himself planning the key's disappearance as a diversion, to conceal his illicit dealings in lesser artifacts. Your fear of retribution was misplaced. The true threat lay not in your silence, but in your employer's ambition." Harper's shoulders sagged. "Then I was complicit, though unwittingly, in his scheme." Holmes placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Complicity by coercion need not endure. Your candor now aids justice." As the lantern guttered, Watson knelt beside the scattered clues and the ledger. "Holmes, we possess the final piece, Morton's confession, albeit overheard. With Harper's testimony and the map of the secret chamber, we can recover the key and lay bare the curator's crimes." Holmes allowed himself a rare smile of satisfaction. "Indeed, Watson. Tomorrow, at sunrise, we shall convene at the hidden oubliette and confront Morton with evidence he cannot obscure." He turned to Harper. "You will accompany us, and recount your account before Inspector Lestrade. Your integrity demands it." The watchman bowed his head, a weight lifted from his heart. Under the hush of the lodge's rafters, Holmes gathered the vials, the ledger, and the scrap of overheard dialogue. He stood poised at the door, lantern in hand, with Watson and Harper at his side. The puzzle's final corner had fallen into place, the curator's duplicity, the dealer's complicity, and the watchman's reluctant silence. Now, with truth rekindled, the path to justice lay open, and the denouement awaited at dawn. Chapter 8, The Final Unveiling. The morning sun filtered through the great hall skylights, illuminating the rows of silent onlookers assembled before the central dais. Holmes stood upon the raised platform, his Inverness cape folded neatly beneath his arm, while Watson and Inspector Lestrade positioned themselves to one side. Around them gathered Mr. Gerald Morton, his niece Evelyn, Mr. George Ellis, Mr. Harper the watchman, and Mr. Collins, the antiquarian jeweller, each unsure why they had been summoned so promptly at dawn. Holmes surveyed their faces with calm composure. His eyes, however, burned with the certainty of one who has already traced every thread to its hidden knot. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured and serene, "I have asked you here to present the solution to our perplexing mystery. As you know, the Obsidian Key vanished from its display last week, setting in motion a chain of events that took us from courtyard to vault, from theatre to chapel, and, at last, beneath this very building." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "I shall now recount how each seemingly disparate clue served to conceal the true culprit and how, through careful observation and logical deduction, we have arrived at the heart of this crime." Holmes first produced the small phial of courtyard clay. This fragment was found at the threshold of the vault, bearing the unique composition of the museum's western planters. Its presence indicated entry by the rear entrance and the thief's hasty passage through the gardens, but it also betrayed one familiar with both the curator's morning routine and the layout of the grounds. He handed the vial to Lestrade, who passed it around the circle. Morton shifted uncomfortably. "Next," continued Holmes, "the scorch residue scraped from the grill suggested the use of a brief flame to disable the internal latch, an action requiring precision and confidence with the museum's locking mechanisms." He held up the tiny glass tube containing the dark fleck. Only someone accustomed to handling these devices could have accomplished such a feat without raising alarm. The inspector nodded, recalling the locked case left undisturbed. Turning, Holmes displayed the fragment of chalk lifted from the theatre prompt book. Here, the same hieroglyph etched upon the Obsidian Key reappeared backstage at the Strand Theatre, an ostentatious marker intended to implicate Miss Morton by way of theatrical association. Evelyn Morton's cheeks flushed, and she pressed a hand to her brooch, as if to reassure herself of her innocence. Yet the chalk itself matches the composition used by the stagehands, not by the students of hieroglyphics. A distraction artfully placed to lure us off course. He paused to survey the chapel's shard of crimson glass. At St. Bartholomew's Chapel, another fragment served a similar purpose, to suggest a sacrilegious link between the relic and sacred ground. But the plainness of this glass is not found in any ecclesiastical window. It was broken elsewhere and carried here to misdirect. Holmes replaced the shard in its resting case and fixed his gaze on Mr. Abbott's absence from the gathering, Abbott having provided critical testimony that night. Again, a clever ruse to embroil the custodian's loyalty in suspicion. Holmes then presented the torn envelope sealed with Miss Morton's crest. This appeared in the vestry, bearing a perfumed lock of hair. Its lavender fragrance matched that upon the billet discovered in the curator's study, further entwining Evelyn's identity with the crime. He allowed a moment's silence before reaching into his pocket for the personal ledger. Finally, we arrive at the true key to this mystery, Mr. Morton's personal ledger, with its coded entries and hidden map. Each pair of letters denoted a transaction. The omega symbol, the archaic omega, marked the highest value artifact, the Obsidian Key. He opened the leather cover to reveal the map of sublevels and the chamber marked with the omega. Here, beneath the curator's study, lies a secret chamber, the very vault in which our priceless relic was consigned. Watson stepped forward at Holmes's invitation and switched on a lantern to reveal a trapdoor concealed in the dais. He unlocked the latch and pulled it open, uncovering a narrow flight of steps descending into shadow. "Will you accompany us, Mr. Morton?" Holmes asked, voice unruffled. Morton swallowed and nodded, his composure finally breaking as he descended the steps, flanked by Inspector Lestrade and the watchman. Moments later, the group re-emerged with the Obsidian Key cradled in Holmes's hand, its jet-black surface gleaming defiantly. "You see," Holmes explained, "the curator engineered the theft of the display case's key as a theatrical diversion, permitting him to remove lesser antiquities without arousing suspicion. He sold these minor relics to Mr. Collins, profiting handsomely, and feigned distress over the key's disappearance to mask his duplicity." Holmes turned to Collins. "Your complicity is evident in the ledger's second-tier entries, Mr. Collins, D and R, M and C, transactions too minor to merit the omega, yet profitable enough in your eyes." Mr. Collins stammered an apology, but Lestrade cut him short. "We shall discuss your involvement at Scotland Yard." Holmes then addressed Morton directly, his tone even but unyielding. "Mr. Morton, you employed every misdirection known to you, bold haze, theatrical chalk, chapel glass, scented hair, to divert inquiry from the ledger's omega symbol and this hidden chamber. Your knowledge of museum security and your own staff facilitated each stage of the deception." Morton's shoulders slumped, his voice cracked as he confessed. Holmes concluded, justice must be served. Yet I trust that, in exposing these machinations, we have preserved the integrity of this institution and reminded all that observation and reason remain the firmest bulwarks against criminal design. He turned to Watson. My dear Watson, will you care to present the Obsidian Key back to the curator? Watson stepped forward, returning the relic to the trembling hands of Mr. Abbott, who had arrived with Lestrade's warrant. As the assembly dispersed, Holmes and Watson lingered in the now empty hall. Watson's eyes shone with admiration. Well done, Holmes. Again you have shown that the smallest fragment, be it clay, chalk, or glass, can shatter the grandest illusion. Holmes inclined his head, permitting himself a rare smile. The criminal mind invariably reveals itself through its errors, Watson. It is our task to detect those errors, however finely concealed. Outside, the city of London pulsed with renewed life, but within the silent grandeur of the museum, reason reigned supreme, and the Obsidian Key once more stood secure under the vigilant gaze of Sherlock Holmes.